Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is LJ Stambuk, and I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. We're delighted to have this distinguished panel with us today. Cybersecurity. What a timely and critical issue this is for our conference. The increasing dependency upon information technology systems and networked operations pervades nearly every aspect of our society. While bringing significant benefits, this dependency can also create vulnerabilities to cyber-based threats. The number of confirmed cyber attacks reported by federal agency has skyrocketed in the past several years, from 5,503 in 2006 to 48,562 in 2012. The U.S. Defense Department claims there are 10 million cyber intrusion attempts made against it every single day. So does the National Nuclear Security Administration. In our most recent presidential elections, the Chinese, for example, have hacked into the Romney campaign, and of all people, the Syrians have hacked into the Obama campaign. So, just everybody agrees that the cyber threat is going to get worse before it gets better. To talk to us today about cybersecurity, U.S. priorities and responsibilities, we have a great panel. It is my honor and privilege to introduce them to you. With us today we have Governor Tim Pawlenty. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Financial Services Roundtable. As a former two-term governor of Minnesota, Tim Pawlenty was a leader with significant executive experience, having overseen a $50 billion budget, led 30,000 state employees, and managed 20 individual state agencies and departments. As chair of the Minnesota State Board of Investment, Governor Pawlenty directed more than $60 billion in public and private investments during his tenure. He served as chair of the National Governors Association from 2007 to 2008 and chair of the Midwest Governors Association from 2006 to 2007. Governor Pawlenty is nationally respected as a serious policymaker who combines his depth of subject matter knowledge with a unique ability to communicate on complex issues. Christopher Painter. Christopher Painter is a coordinator for cyber issues at the U.S. Department of State. Painter coordinates and leads the United States diplomatic efforts to advance an open, interoperable, secure, and reliable Internet information infrastructure. He works closely with components across the department, other agencies, the White House, the private sector, and civil society to implement the President's international strategy for cyberspace and ensures the U.S. foreign policy positions on cross-cutting cyber issues are fully synchronized. Painter has worked with dozens of foreign governments in bilateral meetings and has been a frequent spokesperson and presenter on cyber issues around the globe. Painter is a graduate of Stanford Law School and Cornell University. Ian Wallace. Ian Wallace is a visiting fellow in cybersecurity with the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. He came to Brookings from the British Embassy, where he served as Washington's Defense Policy and Nuclear Counselor. Immediately before joining the embassy, he was a fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University, where his work included research into the military implication of new cyber capabilities. Wallace received his MA in Ancient and Modern History from Christ Church, Oxford University in 1996. Moderator today, Ellen Nakashima. She's a national security reporter for the Washington Post. Ellen focuses on issues relating to intelligence, surveillance, and civil liberties. She has written about the evolution of cyber policy and operations in the U.S. government and its effort to craft rules to govern its growing capabilities. Nakashima is part of a team at the Post that shared the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for revelations of widespread surveillance by the National Security Agency and the policy debates surrounding them. Please join me in greeting them. Thank you for joining us today.
Testing. Okay, now we got it. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm a little cyber challenged here. I guess so.
Chat among yourselves.
All right, let me just speak into this mic. Thank you very much, LJ, for that kind introduction. It's a real honor to be here with you today and to be moderating this distinguished panel. As LJ mentioned, this is cyberspaces. It's a very happening topic. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the World Wide Web, and as LJ noted, it's brought great prosperity and innovation. Something that my own owner of the newspaper, Jeff Bezos, who's the founder of Amazon.com, can attest to quite well. But it's that very openness that has spurred such great growth that has also brought some risks. And we at the Washington Post have also experienced that, along with other major newspapers, Google, a host of Fortune 500 companies, think tanks, government agencies, human rights groups have all been hacked by the Chinese, who are after trade secrets and other intelligence. Major U.S. financial institutions recently have been the target of a debilitating series of denial of service attacks, DDoS attacks, against their public-facing websites by the Iranians, perhaps in retaliation for Western sanctions. And recently we've just heard that Russia has hacked the White House networks, and as well as targeted NATO, Ukraine, Western energy firms. So how do we think about all this? Whose job is it to protect the assets, the critical assets of the United States, which are, after all, largely in the hands of the private sector? How can the government and companies bring about changes in behavior in other countries, other nations that might seek to launch disruptive cyber attacks or steal the commercial secrets of companies for the benefit of their own industries? And how have the revelations of the past year by former NSA contractor Edward Snowden affected the terms of this international debate? So as LJ mentioned, we've got a terrific panel here of experts who can help us sort through some of these issues. We've got roughly an hour, hopefully a good amount of time at the end for questions and answers from you. So we're going to start with some brief introductions by each of the panelists, no more than 4 minutes, I'd say, and then maybe a half hour of discussion. And as we discuss, I'd like to encourage all of you to just jump in and respond to one another so we can keep this as free-flowing as possible. So without further ado, let's start with Chris. Would you like to tell us what progress you've made using diplomacy?
Sure. Can you hear me? Is this working? Okay, great. First I think it's worth setting this in a larger context. I've been doing cyber issues of some sort now for 22 years. I started as a prosecutor prosecuting cybercrime in the 90s. I then went to the Justice Department, where I ran our computer crime section. I went to the FBI briefly. I was at the White House for 2 years setting up the new cyber directorate, and now setting up this new entity at state for the last 3 years, which is focusing on cyber diplomacy. And one of the things I think that I've seen, and I am a recovering lawyer, so normally you say at gatherings like this, you tell a lawyer joke, but I've learned from years of experience, the problem with lawyer jokes is that lawyers don't think they're funny, and non-lawyers don't think they're jokes. So I'll dispense with that and instead cover what I've seen. And one of the things I've seen is certainly I've seen the threat grow over the years, and the threat not just from criminal groups, potentially terrorists, although we haven't really seen them attack infrastructure as of yet, but we're always worried about that, and nation states, and all those actors are very active, and we've become much more dependent on this technology. It used to be, and this is one of the major transformations I've seen, that when you talked about cyber to the senior policymakers, either in the government or in the private sector, quite frankly, at the CEO level, their eyes would roll back in the back of their heads. They'd run screaming from the room because they were like, this is a technical issue. This is not really an issue I want to deal with. I'll outsource this to my technical folks. But what we have now, and I think this is really important, is a recognition that this is a core national security issue, a core economic security issue, a core human rights issue, and ultimately a core foreign policy issue. And in companies, what I've seen, and I've been working with the private sector for many years, I've seen a recognition at that CEO level, that C-suite level, that this is more than just a nuisance. This is something that's a real threat and something they need to deal with, and it affects their bottom line. And some of the thefts of intellectual property, I think, have focused on that. When we talk about these issues in cyberspace, we talk about a very broad swath of topics. Certainly cybersecurity is one, but all of these are interrelated. And we did the international strategy a couple of years ago and talked about maintaining an open, interoperable, secure, and reliable, all of those things, and you can have all of them in cyberspace around the world, in the US and around the world. We talked about the economic aspects and the benefits that cyberspace has given us in the beginning. We talked about internet governance issues and keeping the multi-stakeholder system versus a state-controlled system. We talked about human rights and internet freedom online and preserving that and the free flow of information. We talked about what we call cybersecurity due diligence, what countries should do to better cooperate against threats, to build institutions like CERTs, to have things like we have in the United States, a more integrated cross-governmental approach, to have strategies in this area. We talked about cybercrime and how we should fight cybercrime and having things like laws around the world that deal with this and cooperative mechanisms, and we can go into much more detail on those. And we talked about something we call international security, and I wanted to focus on that for a moment. And this is, in some ways, more the long-term game. You have all these threats, and you certainly have to build better defenses. You have to have good cybercrime laws. But you also have to think about what are the norms of behavior in cyberspace. Is this a totally lawless space or not? And it's not. And one of the things, and I'll just hit on a couple of things that have happened the last year and a half, we got agreement in what's called the UN Group of Governmental Experts. This is 15 countries. It included Russia, it included China, it included India, the US, the UK, Germany, and others. So getting a consensus, no easy task, but a consensus that international law, including the UN Charter, including the law of armed conflict and humanitarian law, apply in cyberspace just like they do in the physical world. Now that's a pretty major accomplishment. We also got something out of the UN Human Rights Council saying that you have the same rights online as you do offline. Again, this might seem intuitive to all of you, but it wasn't really intuitive in the international environment. What that means is that when you get to this very high threshold of armed conflict, whatever that means, that there are laws that apply. Things like distinction and proportionality when you're in wartime. Things like the right to self-defense and how that operates. And those are key concepts. It's not just this free-floating space. So that's happened, but we've also worked on what we call confidence-building measures. This is, has its roots in the nuclear era, where we were trying to build transparency and confidence between either adversaries or frenemies, and we were really working to do the same in cyberspace. So the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, adopted the first ever multilateral confidence measures, 11 of them. I don't know if it's like the Spinal Tap movie, they couldn't settle on 10, but 11. And we are implementing them now. These are basic transparency measures, points of contact, national strategies, mechanisms where any state can raise an issue of concern with other states. Really key measures. We've done these bilaterally with Russia. We've been talking to China about these. Even with countries we fundamentally disagree, we need to focus on that. So there's been a lot of work there. And we've also recently, and I'll talk about this later, talked about what are the norms below that threshold, that very high threshold. What are the peacetime norms? What are the things that states should agree not to do and cooperate together on those issues? So we've had a lot of work in that area too. Now at the same time, we started a real strong dialogue with other countries on the whole range of issues. We talked about the NIST framework that recently was announced in terms of how we should work with our critical infrastructure to protect their systems. And we've talked to the UK, we've talked to France, we've talked to the EU about that, and Japan and others, because we want something that's interoperable. You don't have different standards when you go around the world, and that's important. We've launched these all-of-government bylaws. Our government had stovepipes of excellence, I'd call it before. We have different even agencies who weren't talking to each other, and they weren't necessarily talking to the private sector or other stakeholders. That's much, much better. The amount of coordination in government is a striking difference. But when we do these bylaws with another country, I bring my DoD colleagues, my DHS colleagues, my DOJ colleagues, the whole suite of folks in commerce and others, and that forces those governments to bring everyone too, so we have a real conversation. We've launched those dialogues with Germany, with Brazil, with India, with a number of countries around the world, and we've had them with both in the past with China and Russia. Now, the China one is on hold, given the indictments of the PLA, and as you know, and Ellen mentioned, the president and others have been very clear that the theft of intellectual property, the wholesale theft of intellectual property, is something that is not something that any nation should do, and we've been pushing that very hard. So with that, there's much more I can talk about, but I'll stop there so we can get to questions and elucidate more.
Tim, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for assembling under the banner of the World Affairs Council. This is a distinguished group, and I'm pleased to be here with this distinguished panel. This is a really important topic for a variety of reasons, and with the World Affairs Council perspective, it is profoundly global in its reach and profoundly global in its impact. I thought I would just use my 4 minutes to make a few contextual points. First of all, as Ellen mentioned at the onset, the internet and related systems were built to be open and interconnected. And so now we are about the business of reverse engineering at the margins those systems and platforms to be less open and more secure. But the organizing principle, the organizing philosophy was one of openness, and obviously for security reasons, that has to be re-engineered to a substantial or at least a significant degree. Number two, as we think about potential solutions, I had a chance to spend some time recently with Steve Wozniak, one of the co-founder of Apple, and we talked about this issue at some length. And he said, as we think about the future of cybersecurity, we may have to think about, at least selectively and strategically, thinking about closed or more closed loop systems for certain strategic assets and strategic flows of information. Number three, to give you a sense of the magnitude of the problem just domestically, it was recently reported that 110 million Americans had their personal data exposed during a recent 12-month period. That is 1 out of every 2 adult Americans had their personal data exposed. Now that doesn't mean stolen, manipulated, or damaged, but it does mean some degree of exposure of their personal privacy or their personal data. So, and the frequency and magnitude and sophistication of these attacks is accelerating by the week and by the month, and it is very concerning. Number three, most companies, ranging from small and maybe somewhat modestly equipped to confront some of these issues, all the way up to the largest companies, are not immune from these attacks, including people who put enormous resources and time and staff and state-of-the-art capabilities into defense systems. And so to give you a measure of that, by all accounts, the leading organization in the world in terms of cybersecurity capabilities and defenses is the NSA. And they were hacked. They were breached by an insider threat. Snowden massively breached. And they would give themselves high marks in terms of their capabilities, as would others. And that gives you a sense that no one is immune from this. Another recent study, contextually, is 70%, more than 70% of all the companies that were breached in a recent 12-month period did not know they were breached until a significant period of time after the breach occurred and until a third party told them. Sometimes the government, sometimes a customer, sometimes a vendor, sometimes a other third party, but no matter how sophisticated they think they are, that gives you a sense of the vulnerability and the lack of awareness around these issues. Lastly, this issue and threat has morphed dramatically in recent years. I am the president and CEO of an organization, the Financial Services Roundtable, that is part think tank, part advocacy group, part member service group. But a big chunk of our time and a big chunk of our people do nothing but these issues. Our president of this division, Paul Smoltzer, is here, president of our BITS division. But what we know is this. It used to be college kids in basements predominantly goofing around, having fun, either individually or collectively, just as a kind of a game to see if they can break into systems. It obviously has morphed into organized crime, and it has morphed into semi-state and state-sponsored activity, cross-border and global in implication. But think about what that means to security issues, privacy issues, information issues, potential terrorism issues, self-declared cyber jihadist issues. And if you have an American company, regardless of their capabilities, and it's company XYZ versus a state-sponsored entity, let's say, not to name names, but let's say China, that is not a fair fight. So we need to have a Team America approach to the response to that, and I think Ellen's going to explore the parameters and contours of that as we go forward. There's great work being done intergovernment, there's great work being done government to industry, there's great work being done in terms of oversight and private sector investment and attention to this issue, but you cannot look at today's facts and say what we've done and what has been done is satisfactory. It is not. The current state of affairs in this space is not satisfactory. So much more work needs to be done and much more dramatic steps need to be taken. And I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Jim. Ian?
Thank you very much, and I think this is a great topic for the World Affairs Councils, and there is clearly issues about domestic crime and hacking, but this is inherently an international issue, and particularly when you get some of the more serious threats that Governor Pawlenty was talking about. And I thought it might be quite useful, therefore, to sort of project ahead a little bit and look at some of the themes, the international themes that the international community is going to have to tackle in the next couple of years. Clearly, some of the strands that, in fact, all of the strands, I suspect, that Chris was talking about in terms of norm building and capacity confidence building measures will continue. The group of government experts continues to discuss norms. But there are a few other areas which I think are going to become increasingly important, and I wanted to draw attention to three in particular. First of those is, and it's to a certain extent a post-Snowden factor in international relations, is the convergence of different groups who are dealing with these issues to a much greater extent. So previously we've had a lot of focus on internet governance by really technical experts who see their role as making the internet operate, and they're consider sort of success keeping government out of their business, and to a large extent that has been perfectly sensible for keeping the internet working and building economic success from that. Separately, governments have seen, quite rightly, security as their prerogative. And I think going forward, you're going to see an increasing merging between these two. There's a degree of consensus among the OECD countries, the Western countries, that the best way to do that is in a multi-stakeholder model. Some other countries, China, Russia, more authoritarian states, think this should be government-controlled. But I think even within those states who believe that the private sector and civil society have a role, there's a certain amount of difference about what the relative responsibilities ought to be, and I think that's going to be a challenge to work that through going forward, and then to convince other states who don't quite know how to where their best interests lie that keeping the private sector very much involved in this is in their interests. And that's going to involve making sure that these groups can relate to one another, but not conflating all the issues into one, which is another danger. Second area I think is going to be increasingly important is capacity building. Big conference happening next year in The Hague, fourth of a series of international conferences. And I think capacity building is going to be a key feature of that. How governments together can help other governments, particularly in the developing world, build their capability to prevent threats at source. And to a large extent, this is considered inherently good. If you can help a country stop the cyber threat before it comes to you, then you're doing a good thing. But even then, there are sort of policy issues. Is that capacity building done by the civil sector, by the military, by governments, or by the private sector? And which countries do that capacity building has an influence on the sort of values that they bring to that new country. All issues which are common in international development, but have an added dimension when security is involved. And third area where I think it's going to be increasingly important is international crisis management. At the moment, day-to-day incident management is, again, largely run by technical experts. Around the world, there's a growing number of computer security, incident response teams who network with each other, work with network operators who all know each other, know each other's phone numbers, and manage threats in an extraordinary way, given the complexity of the machine that they collectively operate. But as people become more and more dependent on information technologies, governments become more and more aware of their political exposure if security is breached, and societies are affected by that. And as more and more governments get involved, they are being expected to take more responsibility. And the bureaucracies exist to manage security incidents at an international level are often sort of military organizations, or organizations that are probably not well suited to operating in this way. And so working through how organizations like NATO, which are becoming more aware of their responsibilities in cyber, can bring their expertise to this issue without putting cyber threats immediately onto a military escalator ladder, I think is going to be an important challenge going forward, and one of those things that governments are going to need help from civil society and the private sector in order to work through.
Thank you very much, Ian. In fact, I'd like to start by pegging off the third area. You talked about international crisis management. And drawing on something Chris alluded to, which is sort of how can you respond to an incident, marshaling sort of the efforts of like-minded states and their security experts within them. So I mentioned at the beginning the DDoS attacks against the major banks. How many of you are actually familiar with that and with what a DDoS is? Okay, about a quarter. So in short, distributive denial of service attack is when an attacker basically leverages, marshals many computers together in what is often called a botnet to send waves of internet traffic, a digital assault against your computer server, let's say, and pings it with so much traffic that you essentially, it crashes a server. So you don't have effective use of it, it's not dead, but your server can be offline for a while. Well, that's what happened to a number of major banks in 2012. Sometimes taking them down for hours at a time. It didn't, affect the actual transferal of money, but it did cost the banks, I think, tens of millions of dollars in remediation costs. So what was interesting about that incident is that because it affected a critical sector, the banks, the US government was also very concerned about it, and discussed, well, what shall we do? What can we do? This DDoS campaign went on for months, and the US government, rightly so, I think, determined that it hadn't reached the level of damage, it hadn't killed anyone, after all, that would warrant, let's say, a military intervention. Although there was some internal debate about having the NSA, or the Military Cyber Command, undertake a cyber action that might have shut down the attack at its source, presumably in Iran. The government also rejected the idea of a démarche, a stern message to Iran through a neutral country. But what they did do, which I find interesting, and I'd like Chris to talk a little bit about it, is the State Department, along with the Department of Homeland Security, reached out to a total of about 120 countries and asked them to help choke off that denial of service traffic from servers emanating from servers in their country. And Chris, can you tell us a little bit more about that, and how effective was that action? And what does this say about the level of pain and disruption that the US government is willing to tolerate in the private sector before it gets involved?
So first I should say that although Ellen has made a lot of factual statements, I'm not concurring with any of those factual statements necessarily. So just as
the US government never officially acknowledged that they thought Iran was behind
But I will say this, what I will say is that indeed is true. One When I talked about different things we're trying to build around the world, one of them, not surprisingly, is to try to build cooperation among states against third-party threats. I mean, part of it is addressing threats from states, but also how do you build this norm, if you will, or practice of cooperation against these threats, which are increasingly hitting everyone, frankly. And so when you're talking about denial of service attack, you can have, these are tens of thousands, sometimes millions of compromised computers that are all over the world, and the concentration can shift day to day, or even sometimes hour to hour. So you might have a big concentration in Germany, you might have it in Russia, you might have it in the US. Often there are many in the US because we have a lot of the bandwidth. So how can you mitigate a threat like that, which is very difficult because although it wasn't debilitating the financial institutions, it didn't get into the back room or deal with the integrity of their data, it did cause them a great deal of pain and money, and that was difficult. So how do you do that? So one thing we did, obviously we were working with the financial institutions to talk about remediation and other things that they could do. You know, that's part of it. But partly we were then reaching out to our technical experts, our U.S. CERT people on the Department of Homeland Security, to all of their counterparts around the world and saying, can you help us? They do that pretty normally. We use law enforcement channels to reach out. But the thing that was different in this case, and this goes to this being more of an important issue, is we reached out using diplomatic démarches. And before I went to the State Department, I always thought a démarche was a bad thing. It just sounds bad. It just sounds like, you're yelling at someone. But a démarche can be a good démarche. You can ask them to help you. And so we went to over 25 countries, and we asked those countries, look, you've gotten this request, this technical request. We're raising this to a higher political level. We really want you, this is an important one. This is not just the noise. We really want your help in this. And we have to be willing to help you if you have similar problems. And we got, each country has different laws, different capabilities of how they deal with this, how they reach out to their internet service providers, what they can do within their own borders. But we got a lot of cooperation. And what happened was, when you raise this to a level, it's not just the technical operators, where the foreign ministry people or the prime minister office or others around the world were saying, okay, this is an important issue. We got a lot of good cooperation. And that is a model I think we want to continue to build and work on, try to build that greater cooperation. It doesn't deal with every threat out there. We have other crime and other things that we have to address in different ways. But in terms of these kinds of threats, I think it's helpful to build that environment. It also goes to something that Ian said, which is this idea of capacity building. We've done a hell of a lot of capacity building, the U.S. has in the last couple of years, focused largely in Africa, but also in other countries as well. We've done regional ones in East Africa, West Africa, South Africa, where we not only talk about some of these issues of how they can build institutions, have capabilities so that they can help them and help us, frankly, and have good laws in place, and have good strategies in place, but we also bring the private sector and others in on those trainings so that we are walking the walk. We're saying that this kind of partnership is important. It's not just governments that are doing these things. And the last thing I'd say is just another comment on and I quite agree with Tim that we have a long way to go yet. This is something where none of us, I think, are satisfied that we're done and we can put away our books and just watch everything unfold. There's a lot more work to do in this space, and to Ian's point, this problem of all these things coming together is an issue because, frankly, when you talk about cybersecurity in the U.S., you mean security of networks. When you talk about it in some countries like Russia and China, you mean security of information. They're worried about the free flow of information. They're worried about destabilizing speech. And there's this vast group in the middle, a lot of the developing world countries who are worried about stability, but they're also worried about economic growth and worried about social growth. And we really need to work with those countries both to make us more secure, but also so that this vision, this open but secure vision of the internet persists.
Tim?
Yeah, I would just, I think Chris has done a great job outlining how government can be involved and be effective in responding to a threat, and in that case, really helpful and appreciated. I will say on the distributed denial of service attacks, the DDoS attacks, we jokingly say a little tongue-in-cheek, they're so 2012. Look, the DDoS attacks are annoying. They slow up websites. They junk up the consumer experience. They're frustrating, but they're not debilitating. So, is that ultimately what we're most worried about? No. We appreciate the help. And also a question arises, what were the adversaries doing in that regard? Were they really just trying to slow up the website and the consumer experience, or were they up to something else? Were they pinging and probing for potential future attacks. So we're certainly mindful of DDoS attacks, and they unfold in, at least by cyber standards, semi-slow motion. So you have a day, a half a day, 2 days to get on the phone, do what you need to do to try to marshal a response. The threats that are coming now or could come in the future happen at network speed. And before you know what happened, the damage could be done in milliseconds. So there's not an opportunity to say, hey, let's have a demarge over the next week. It could be you wake up tomorrow morning and you got a cyber you-know-what storm. So the ability to respond is limited effectively, so you have to have deterrence and systems and consequences in place ahead of time. So let me give you a couple of examples that are hypothetical. Let's say somebody got into electronic medical records and changed everybody's blood types. Let's say that somebody got into financial service records and moved the decimal point over one to the left. Let's say somebody can prey upon small and medium-sized financial institutions or private equity firms that are involved in mergers and acquisitions, and they get the jump on information pre-public disclosure. Let's say somebody can uncode algorithms in exchanges and alter them in ways that manipulate the exchange, currency or trading. Let's say somebody can get into the payment systems, trillions, tens of trillions of dollars just domestically, much less globally, per day, can disrupt that for a month. And your ability to buy point-of-sale electronic payments at the grocery store or order inventory at the grocery store is gone, not for a day, but for a month. Let's say they can shut down the electrical grid for a month. The list goes on, and you can lose a lot of sleep over this, but these are extraordinarily serious matters. And the ability potentially for somebody to invoke one of those scenarios can happen in a millisecond, not a week. So we have to be thinking proactively about how do you deter that and stop it. And the DDoS attacks, I hate to say it, are not just a bit outdated, but they are modest in their sophistication.
And I should say, I would agree. I mean, that's just a good example. If you build these cooperative networks, you use them against all threats that you have.
Yeah.
And this is only one part of the defense you have to have. You have to have, for instance, deterrence by denial, have better defenses that are set up to be able to deal with that. You also have to take the long-term game and say, well, what are the things that we want to start conditioning people to not do? So one of these peacetime norms I mentioned is that states should refrain, and I'll read it to you, and these are new. These are things we're now promulgating, the U.S. is. A state should not conduct or knowingly support cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property, trade secrets, or other confidential business information with the intent of providing it to their commercial sector. That's something we've heard the President and others have said. But a state should not conduct or knowingly support online activity that intentionally damages critical infrastructure or otherwise impairs the use of critical infrastructure to provide services to the public. And that's also coupled with one where we talk about a need to cooperate if you see things emanating from your territory. This is not going to happen in a day or a week.
Yeah. I think it's great, but I mean, the question arises, what is an agreement worth with people who don't value agreements? And nobody enforces them. So, what's an agreement worth with North Korea, Iran, Russia?
But part of this is, it's like any other field of international relations. I take money laundering as an example, where you had countries who were turning a blind eye to this. And so what you do is, and this is certainly is not the whole solution, this is just one part of the solution. You build the consensus of countries who agree with that. If countries are outside of it, they get marginalized, and then you think about how you enforce these things. And so a good example is a proliferation security initiative. We were worried about people trading nuclear material. So if first a smaller group of countries and a larger and larger group of countries both didn't do things themselves and also tried to enforce sanctions and other things on countries who are on the outside. So that's more of a long-term effort. Now, I would say there's also the things you have to do for better defense. There's also things you need to do for better incident response. All of this has to go together, and not one of them is a silver bullet.
So you sort of build a group of like-minded countries who isolate the outlier and apply peer pressure.
There's peer pressure, but there's other things you can do too.
Name and shame.
I think name and shame is one, but I think you could even do other kinds of activity. But it's a long-term thing. We don't have those norms in place yet.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce Chris's point by making the observation that when we think about cybersecurity and international sort of cyber threats, we tend to think in cyberspace. And I think one of the important things to remember is that cyber attackers, people involved in this, are themselves people. And one of the best ways to, or one of the worst things you can do is get suckered into playing the attacker's game. In the sense that in this area, offense tends to be dominant. It's easier to attack than defend, as Tim has been saying. One of the great strengths that the US has is its ability to operate in other domains as the biggest economy, biggest military. Hopefully we won't need to resort to that, but to have significant influence around the world. And one of the, I think, lessons that we can learn from the experience of the DDoS attacks is you can successfully operate outside of the cyber domain to deliver results that you want to get. And to pick up another of Chris's points, a good example of this in a different context is money laundering, that over the last decade or so, the United States has done a great job of using its position in the financial system to prevail on countries like Iran and North Korea to take certain actions. And I think one of the tricks going forward is to understand what are in countries' interests and then bringing them to bear in order to stop them doing things in cyberspace that are against the interests of the United States or their allies.
Right. You often hear the administration talking about an all-tools approach to cyber, which is you don't, in response to a cyber attack, necessarily respond in cyber. You can, and in fact should, resort to military actions only as a last resort. You have diplomacy, you have law enforcement, security. You also have financial sanctions. I'm interested in this because, as you know, commercial cyber espionage by China is one of the biggest problems that we face now in national security and economic security. And recently, as Chris mentioned, earlier this year, the US indicted 5 Chinese military PLA officials on charges of commercial cyber espionage. And despite high-level talks, president to president even, between China and the US, the cyber commercial theft continues unabated, I think. So wondering here, is it time to try a new approach? We've tried diplomacy, we've tried law enforcement indictments. What about financial sanctions? What do you think? After all, financial sanctions help bring Iran back to the negotiating table in nuclear talks?
I'll just say, with respect to China, as you mentioned earlier, I think Chris mentioned earlier, we're dealing with countries and cultures that have different legal systems, different legal norms, different views about how they do or don't use government for certain purposes. So if you kind of think of it in 3 buckets, stealing government information, stealing industry information, and then, organized crime / terrorism / mayhem for other reasons. As it relates to government information, the position of our government writ large is they don't acknowledge it publicly, but let's say hypothetically they spy for purposes of national security reasons, but they don't spy for purposes of commercial advantage and then share it with the private sector. The Chinese don't share that view. They have a different view of the role of government in their economy, a different view of the role of government with respect to these activities. They also have a different view about kind of the legal norms and what that means in terms of the burdens and responsibilities it does or doesn't impose on them. And then there's the issue of kind of cyber terrorism, cyber data destruction and management. So I think I would ask the question, how is it working currently for us? We've had a decade of speeches and comments and conferences and summits and salons and admonishments and demarches and whatever. How's it working? Chinese slowed down? They still stealing the stuff at about the same level or accelerating? I think the answer to that, in my view, is not working so well. So it's time to try something new, and people tend to respond to incentives and consequences. The current incentives and consequences are not sufficient to deter their behavior. So I think strategically and selectively, upping the consequence side of the ledger would be in order.
So financial sanctions, trade sanctions, maybe might be.
Well, whatever, there's a basket to choose from, but I think, the discussions that we've had and the activities, again, appreciated and helpfully directionally, but I think you'd have to reasonably conclude they haven't worked.
Ian?
This is a question, I guess, for Tim. One of the aspects of sort of setting the sort of cyber topic in the wider context is that the trade relationship with China is so fundamental to the prosperity of the global economy and likely to become more so. Do you think the benefits from getting into a trade war with China would be justified in terms of the additional cybersecurity?
I mean, the approach of most American companies has been, look, we'll put second generation products into China, not our best technology, because we presume they're going to steal it. But we want a 5 or 7 year run in the marketplace of 1.3 billion people so we can sell cars or whatever the item is for a while, and until if they want it, they replicate it and rebrand it and sell it themselves. So that's been the trade-off. But now the Chinese have been, and others, unsatisfied with that in public reports, and now steal the first-class generation technology and want to bring it back to China. And to the extent it is innocuous stuff, fertilizer recipes or the like, maybe that doesn't rise to the level of setting off these kinds of issues. But there may be incursions or violations or behaviors that do rise to the level. And I think within our legal norms and our political systems, the message needs to be, we're going to do to you what you do to us. And, again, it has to be within acceptable political and legal norms and frameworks and practices, but more speeches, more conferences does not appear to be working.
Well, a couple of things. One, we're not going to steal trade secrets.
No, I don't mean commercially. I don't mean commercially.
But I think we have to look at this, as I think everyone said, there's a number of tools that can be used, and this is not just about cyber on cyber. This is not just, we're concerned about cyber activities, so we'll respond just in this narrow cyber realm. I think it's clear, and I think you've heard from the president just yesterday from Secretary Kerry when he was giving a speech was that this affects the overall U.S.-China relationship. That's an important signal that needs to be made. I will say, up until about 2 years ago, no one was raising this, even publicly. This was not being raised. And so I don't believe for a moment that the diplomatic aspect is the only way to cure this problem. That's one area where you have to raise the cost and say there's reputational and other costs. And it can't just be the U.S. The U.S. is not the only victim of this activity. It has to be other countries, I think, similarly making these statements and joining together. And that's part of it. We also have to do a lot more in terms of defenses and resilience and sharing information. Recently, there were some signatures that were shared that were shared by our technical community about attacks coming from China and some attribution that came out of that. I think that's important. I think this is going to be a suite of different activities, and we even said in the larger context in the international strategy that we're going to respond using all the tools in our tool set, and we're going to do that. We're going to do it in a way that's going to be precise, but we need to make this part of a larger conversation. That's not a cyber.
I'll tell you a funny story. I was in China on a trade trip when I was governor, and one of their business leaders said to me, this intellectual property theft issue will be resolved when the quality and sophistication of Chinese domestically produced intellectual property and technology advances to the point where the Chinese steal from each other. And then they will have legal systems and frameworks in place to stop it. But if it's just stealing from foreigners, then there's not much incentive to stop it.
I think there's something to that. I will say that I used to, when I was a prosecutor, I also did intellectual property cases, and you have seen on cyber trade secrets aside, you've seen some progress in the way that those have been handled over the years, and that's because of economic pressure, it's because of diplomatic pressure, it's because of company pressure. I think that all has to happen. And I do think, even if the Chinese don't accept the difference between espionage for purposes of protecting citizens and benefiting economies, there's also cost to their own economy from doing this. This is something harder to grasp because it's a long-term issue. It's innovation, their ability to innovate, their ability to get markets, their ability to get foreign investment. All of these things, I think, have to be factored in. And we just need to be strong about presenting that case to them, and I expect we will continue to be that.
As the Brit on the panel, I would observe that through the whole of the 19th century, the world's worst offender for intellectual property theft was the United States, until it became in the interests of the United States to protect intellectual property, and there was a very profound sort of flip. So there may be lessons you can draw from that, but I would also argue that in the international context, there is an argument to be won with the rest of the world, that picking up on the idea that the best way to deal with some of these issues is to set international norms. It's not a given that economic espionage is a bad thing in many countries other than China. And I think one way to isolate China, who are undoubtedly the worst offender, is to build that case and bring along other allies, for example, in Europe, who sort of recognize the problem, are victims of the problem, but are not willing to sort of step onto the front foot. And I think that there's some coalition building to be done there in order to build a consensus that this is unacceptable behavior and that the world will not accept it.
At the same time, there's this whole other aspect when we talk about China as a country. They are one of the biggest cyber actors now, and so we have to address this concern. We have to address it in a strong way. We also have to figure out how to have better transparency between us, and how, if you want to avoid misperception, miscalculation, and inadvertent escalation in cyberspace, just like you do in the physical world. So we have to be able to do that with the Chinese too, and figure out some constructive way of dealing with them, and at the same time addressing these issues head on. So it's not a binary relationship. We have to look at all these things, because that will hurt. Quite frankly, that also will hurt private business. If you get an escalation in cyberspace, if you get the much dreaded and over-talked about cyber conflict that will affect the private sector as well as governments, you don't want that. You don't want those things happening, so you have to address those things too.
So I'd like to have time for questions, but I wanted to ask one more question, this one's Snowden related, especially get Tim's perspective on this, since just a few months ago, Germany, you may have heard, canceled a big contract with Verizon for its communications network that would link the various government ministries out of fear of NSA or government spying. Tim, what do you think now? How do you restore confidence post-Snowden in U.S. industry and keep them competitive in the global marketplace? And we've talked about confidence building measures with China and Russia, but what about CBMs with the Europeans?
Well, I would make a few comments relative to the aftermath of Snowden and the collateral consequences of it. First of all, in terms of the domestic policy debate, post-Snowden, the ability to talk about the need for legislation or policy changes relating to information sharing between industry and government has become increasingly complicated. And two issues have been conflated. There's a legitimate concern about the protection of personal privacy and identity information. But what we're talking about when we talk about information sharing between the government and the industry is really sharing threat information, the nature and aspects of the threat, the malware, for example. But in the public discourse, and at the level of, say, Congress, those two things have been confused and conflated, and it has become an excuse for not taking action to try to modernize our cyber information sharing laws. And that's unfortunate, because many of the changes to those laws as it relates to sharing information and security clearances and other things would be helpful. That's number one. Number two, foreign entities and interests have said, look, post-Snowden, we have some concerns about American provision of services in the IT area, including servers or data storage and the like. An interesting question is how much of that is real and how much of that is a convenient excuse to corral and bring business and kind of ring fence business back in their home country. And then lastly, the idea that if you are able to physically relocate servers from Minnesota to Sweden, and therefore you're protected in cyberspace from whoever, if you know a little bit about how server farms operate and data storage operates connected to the internet, is probably not a very strong distinction. So I think it is a political argument, a rhetorical argument, maybe a little turf, a little confusion. But as it relates to trying to say bring that data storage capability or cloud capability to, say, Germany as opposed to Minnesota, as a technological matter and a security matter, it is more rhetoric than substance.
And I guess I'd point to a couple of things. One, this has been used. There's a vast difference about what the U.S. does and the debate that's happened in the U.S. over the past year and a half, and the controls that are in place in the U.S., and the fact that we don't target dissidents or try to, or religious beliefs or sexual beliefs or other issues, which some more repressive regimes are using this to say, well, this is why we need more governmental control of the internet. This is why the U.S. is not a fair actor. And I think that's short-sighted. And a lot of, I think, the world and our allies particularly understand that the long-term goals for us remain the same. We need to get beyond this. On your point on information sharing, I agree. I mean, the NIST framework was an important thing, but we still need information sharing between, and I've dealt with this for 20 years. You need to have that information sharing both ways, and I think that's important. And then on what countries are doing, there's a lot of countries that are now trying to create local clouds, Schengen clouds, other clouds, because, as you say, they're saying, well, this is the reaction to the Snowden debate, but often it's because of economic or other issues, or in many cases, a view that a lot of evidence in criminal cases is here in the U.S., and it's hard for the authorities in these countries to get the information they need for their cases. So Brazil has this legislation, and part of it had this data localization requirement. And they pulled that. That didn't end up going through. They recognized that for their own businesses, it was bad to have that requirement, and so I think economics is kind of kicking in and helping in this area. And then on MLAD issues, or mutual legal assistance, there's been a lot of work that the U.S. has announced about trying to streamline that process, trying to give DOJ more resources to kind of answer the mail on that, which I think is another issue that's creeping up here that's causing countries to try to put servers in their countries, and it doesn't make sense. It's not scalable. You can't have every company putting servers in every country. It's just not possible.
Okay. All right, thank you. Let's open it up for a question or two, and we have mics coming around. And would you please identify yourself? Thank you.
Thank you for a super presentation. Over the last several years, I've heard similar talks, and it's always been about defending ourselves against attack. A couple of years ago, there was a successful attack in Iran against their subterfuges, and I think the U.S. and Israel had something to do with that. Is it safe to assume that our military is tapping into the Chinese military? General Electric is going into everybody else's stuff. I mean, if I'm being attacked and knowing it, I'm sure it's going to hell do the exact same thing to the attackers. Is there something wrong with my thinking?
Well, you go ahead, Chris. Yeah, you go ahead.
Don't all rush once to answer.
Well, if I understood your question correct, I think your mic cut out on the GE part, but you were asking, is the U.S. military or presumably intelligence services involved in spying? I think yes. So
You would hope so.
and we hope so, but that's for national security issues relating to military and intelligence and security issues. I doubt that they're probing around into the Chinese fertilizer manufacturer so they can steal the fertilizer formula and bring it back to southern Minnesota. And as to GE, I missed your point on GE. You're asking whether GE is spying for commercial purposes?
Well, I picked GE out of the hat. But I'm sorry, I picked GE out of the hat, but I think any corporation that knows they're being spied on, who has tremendous secrets, would be interested in am I being spied on domestically or by being spied on internationally.
Well, they're definitely interested, but keep in mind, there's a law in the books in the United States that private entities and individuals cannot essentially hack back or attack back. In other words, violate the parameters of somebody else's databases and manipulate data and destroy data. That's against the American law. So the only entities that are equipped to respond affirmatively or proactively is the United States government.
And I'd say there is also trade secrets law that companies are not supposed to steal. Part of the norm is companies are not supposed to steal trade secrets from other companies. I prosecuted those cases, and we've had other cases recently on that. But I think the point is exactly that. Yes, and this has been something that the president and others said. Yes, we'll conduct intelligence gathering for purposes of protecting our citizens against terrorism and other threats. We've been clear about that. We've been clear in this debate over the last year and a half that we do that, what the parameters are, what some new parameters will be with respect to that. But, there are certain things we don't do. And I mentioned some in terms of going after people for their religious, economic, and political beliefs. But also we do not target companies, we do not target governments to steal commercial information to benefit our commercial sector. And that's something we think no country should do. And that's something we're
And even if China could do something, it's not in their best interest to do something dramatic. If they steal commercial secrets, that's one thing. But let's say they had the algorithms for an exchange or a trading platform. It's probably not in their best interest to use it, so we could probably retaliate, or presumably retaliate in kind in the Shanghai exchange. However, let's say Iran has that, or North Korea has that, or the Haqqani network has that, or Hamas has that. Are they going to be similarly deterred?
And so this goes to this larger issue of rogue actors, whether they be criminal actors, rogue actors generally, and how you deter that behavior, both building resilience, so there's part of it there, but also, like we said, our declarative policy is that if you have a significant enough cyber incident, and you measure that by impact, you measure it by intent, you measure it by actor, we have a range of options we could do, and they range everything from diplomatic to economic to, in cyber or even military. Military, to be sure, is the last resort, as Ellen said, but you have, just like you have in any other attack, physical attack, you have to have that range of activities available.
And just to boil it down on the private sector point, there are good reasons why the US has laws that prevents companies going out to attack other countries or other companies in other countries, and indeed other companies in the United States. But on the international side, you really don't want private actors starting wars on your behalf, or start creating incidents that could escalate into something that becomes much more serious.
Well, and there's also this technical issue. If you may say, oh, I know where I'm getting attacked from. I'm going to go back against those guys. And it could be like an innocent third party in the UK, for instance, that had nothing to do with it. So, there is all those problems as well.
Okay. Well, I'm getting a sign that I think we're going to have to wrap up, but perhaps if you're in the audience, you could come up.
I really hate this part of my job, but we must do what we must do, and that right now means thanking Ellen, Chris, Governor Pawlenty, and Ian Wallace. Thank you all for the great discussion.